So for the Cold War series, we're going to be covering what is essentially the same information that we're doing that I did with regular and honors. Um, the PowerPoints I shared with you are a little bit different. I'm kind of working my way through tweaking and updating several of these PowerPoint lectures, and I did kind of a major update last year, but as I was looking at it. This weekend, trying to decide exactly how I was going to do this. I decided I wasn't very happy with the ones that I have. Not that the information in them is bad, just that I didn't like the way I had presented the information, rather. So I'm going to I'm going to lecture from the regular and honors PowerPoints because I really feel like this year I kind of got it right in the way I was presenting the information with them. And I had tweaked it a couple of times. And I'll be honest, with the short amount of time we have to cover the Cold War, I don't know that I have time this week to get the dual credit ones completely revamped. So I'm going to lecture off of these. The ones that you have access to on my website, there's nothing wrong with them, but you just might want to be sure that if you're watching the video and you're like, oh, this doesn't follow the PowerPoint that I have notes on exactly, that's perfectly fine. You can also view the ones that are under regular and honors under that particular lecture notes tab. I wanted to make that point first, and then the second point is going to be if you are a fan of reading instead of doing instead of listening to a bunch of notes or whatever, then you can also do that. If you go, excuse me, I'm trying to cut out caffeine and it's making me yawn. Okay, sorry. So if you go to and I shared this in everybody's eCampus, okay, there's a link that takes you to to this textbook, and then there's also a link that pulls up the PDF so that you can log in. So if you would rather read and study it that way, you certainly can. Just kind of follow that. If you have trouble logging in, let me know. But this is kind of what it looks like. It pulls up on your screen like this, and it's really easy to kind of flip through. There's nothing hard about it, just like this. It's cool because you've got little maps that pop up. If you go to the beginning of the chapters, you're going to see there's some little video links that you can watch if you're really interested in that. And so it just breaks it down very neatly. And again, this is one of the major differences between regular and honors and dual credit, which is, the way we chunk the material and the amount of time you have to process the information. If you're in dual credit, you're processing very, very quickly and you're assimilating a lot of information very quickly. Whereas in regular and honors, you have more time to do this. So the big difference that you're going to notice with this textbook is that the pieces are much smaller. And you're going to kind of be able to work your way through it. So if you'd rather do that, if you feel more comfortable with those kind of smaller chunks, then please feel free to look at the textbook. The other thing that I want to point out is that we are going to be looking at the Cold War. So you're talking about Chapter 18. You're going to be looking a little bit at Chapter 19, slightly less so because Chapter 19 has more to do with the domestic side of the 1950s, but we will be touching on that somewhat. So you might consider taking a look at the 1950s. There's some interesting things here, things like the emergence of the teenager and that kind of thing. So you want to be sure that you're paying attention to that and kind of looking through that. So this is a really good resource for people. And then the other thing that we'll be covering that kind of goes out of order with the textbook is we're going to be talking about Vietnam. And we're going to look at Vietnam as really kind of a piece of the Cold War. We're also going to be talking about the space race some, and kind of including in that kind of the race to the moon and that sort of thing. But that'll be kind of put in along the side. You can see that the textbook places this squarely within kind of the social turmoil of the 1960s. And Vietnam War is definitely a bridge between the Cold War and the social turmoil. So it definitely kind of encompasses both of those, but we're going to focus primarily on the Cold War aspect of it, because I think that's really where the STAR test is going to be. The other thing I want to mention as well is there's several key terms. This comes from an assignment that I gave to my regular and honors kids. And this is one that I had a student do that was particularly well done. And so I thought I would share it with you guys. And because it really calls out some of these key terms. What we're talking about here is this idea of containment, this idea of containing communism. When we look at NSC 68 and we talk about the long telegram and we talk about some of those things, you'll see that there's this real idea coming out of World War II. That is, we really have to be on the lookout for expansion of communism. And we're going to take specific actions to kind of limit it, to contain it, to put it in a box, if you will. And remember that part of this containment policy is not just military, it's also economic. So the economics of it is going to be very, very important. This is where the Marshall Plan comes in. Europe is decimated after World War II. So we need to find a way to help Europe rebuild. And one of the things, and I think I mentioned this when we talked about the 1930s, when you're talking about a dictatorship, it is an efficient way to rebuild your economy, to rebuild your industry, because there's no discussion, there's no debate, right? One of the things that many new countries find frustrating about democracy is the level of stasis, of just like nothing getting done. And then you have these periods of massive, action, right? And that can be kind of those fits and spurts kind of get frustrating. Well, dictatorship offers an easy answer to that because you streamline the process. However, that's not going to lead to democracy. And remember, one of the things we've talked about with World War II is how the U.S. is suddenly very, very concerned about expanding democracy all over the world. So we're going to see that the Marshall Plan is designed specifically to extend American financial resources to Europe, to give them lots of money and support and loans and all that kind of stuff, to really help these countries rebuild. And of course, this is primarily for these countries that had not been, like France, Austria, kind of that West Germany portion, those areas that had not been taken over by the Soviet Union. So you'll want to be sure you know the Marshall Plan. You'll want to be sure that you know about the Berlin airlift, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Remember, one of the issues with the Berlin blockade, and I think it's in 1948 or so, you have the Allies basically take the American, French, and British zones of Germany, and they unify them into what is West Germany. And so you have a West Germany that's democratic, you have an East Germany that's communist, you have a capital city of Berlin that also had 4 zones, right? And so the French, American, and English zones unify into West Berlin, and then, of course, the Soviets in East Berlin. So within the middle of East Germany, you have Berlin, and particularly West Berlin. And so this is going to be one of the issues that we see happening. And so Russia wants Berlin to be all communist. They want to push out the Americans and the British in particular. And basically the U.S. says, no, we're not leaving. And so Stalin responds by basically blockading Berlin. Okay, fine, you don't get any resources, you don't get any food or anything like that. Well, the initial idea is that, and remember, a blockade can be perceived as an act of war. That's something that's very important. We'll talk about this when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That when you blockade something and you don't allow shipments in or out, that can be perceived as aggressive, right? So the U.S. could have responded with military force, but Truman does not, right? Remember, Truman's not interested in perpetuating a war. He dropped the atomic bomb not because he thought war was awesome, but because he wanted to save lives. So that's one of the big issues that we have going on here. And so Truman will respond by having Berlin airlift, by having these planes. It's like every 20 minutes you have planes flying over, dropping supplies into West Berlin. And this goes on for like 11 months or something like that. And eventually East Germany will lift the blockade and they will allow supplies into West Berlin. And it's, not very long after that, about 10 years later, they're going to start to build a wall around West Berlin to very tightly control kind of goods that are goods and people coming in and out of West Berlin. So that's kind of one of the interesting things about the Berlin Wall. This is kind of the origin of the Berlin Wall, which we'll talk about a lot as we start moving towards the 1980s and that kind of thing. The next thing you want to know is the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is this idea that we're going to stop and contain communism wherever we find it, that it's not just military aid, it's financial aid, it's any kind of aid we want. So basically the Truman Doctrine is an extension of the Four Freedoms speech, right? If you're thinking in terms of the Four Freedoms speech is establishing democracy for the world, and we're going to do these things to protect democracy. The Truman Doctrine is the doctrine that actually puts feet to it, that actually says, you know what, our policy now is going to be that we're going to stop communism, we're going to stop that, we're going to preserve democracy everywhere around the world with whatever aid we can possibly need to give it. And it's very, very important that you understand what the Truman Doctrine is, that it's this idea. Its initial origin was with Greece and Turkey, but it gets applied in a much bigger sense. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO is a very important piece. We still have NATO today. We're still a member of NATO. NATO is basically a relationship between the United States and Western Europe, and it includes Turkey as well. And basically it commits the United States to kind of a defense pact. Now, we remember what the alliance system did in World War I. Now, this kind of alliance, this kind of organization is not going to, it's not going to trigger the same kind of effect that we saw with World War I. But definitely NATO makes decisions and they do things together with the aid of the United States. And it's a much smaller organization. So NATO, the U.S. can get agreement to do things. If you think about Bosnia, in the 1990s when Clinton authorized some bombing campaigns to kind of end the genocide there. Occasionally NATO will do things with North Africa, if you think about the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Libya and that kind of thing. So NATO is very concerned with the Mediterranean region and with the Atlantic Ocean. It was created as a response to kind of this presence of the Soviet Union and its creation of satellite countries thanks to the Iron Curtain. So NATO was meant to kind of counterbalance that and basically tell the Soviet Union to step off, right? And of course, part of this is because Europe is decimated, right? Europe doesn't have the resources to fund a military expansion. So the U.S. is basically like, hey, we got your back. You don't have to worry about diverting resources away from rebuilding roads and schools and hospitals to build a military because we'll provide the military sources for you. And that's a great plan, right? Now, one of the problems is that what we see is that the United States continues to have this process of serving NATO, and so that now what we've seen is that Europe has not had to invest in its own military to the extent that the United States has. And so they've been allowed to divert these resources to social programs and all that kind of stuff. So this is one of kind of the unknown things having to do with our relationship with Europe that I think is very relevant to today, especially when you consider that the terrorist attacks, is NATO not diverting enough resources into counterterrorism action, have these countries that sit in judgment of the United States and our lack of health care and that kind of thing is part of that because they've able to not had to use their own military and finance that to the extent that the United States has. You definitely see that Sputnik and the National Defense of Education Act, Sputnik, we'll talk about that, gets launched by the Soviets, terrifies the United States. The United States has this huge fear of that the U.S. has somehow fallen behind in math and science, and so the National Defense of Education Act, is signed into law, gives tons of money to U.S. education, specifically for math and science, but it also goes to colleges, all this kind of stuff. So it's a major investment in our education system. And I mentioned the connection to Sputnik because I think it's very important for you to grasp that it was the fear of Sputnik that made the U.S. sit up and take notice. We had thought that we were so much better than the Soviet Union. And when Sputnik gets launched, even though Sputnik's not really doing anything, it's a blinking light bulb, literally. The U.S. has this fear that we are inferior and that if we don't start really investing in our society, that if we keep relying on nuclear power, that eventually the Soviets are going to outdo us. And so it really kind of is this huge social investment that we see happening in the United States. And it's very much part of the Cold War, right? It's investing in ourselves to make ourselves stronger. If you're going to run a marathon, you're going to train yourself to run a marathon. And it was the same idea with the United States and kind of attacking this Cold War theory. So if you have things like NATO and the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift, those are specific actions having to do with foreign policy. But NDEA is going to be an action that has to do with building ourselves up and making ourselves strong and able to fight the Soviet Union. The last two concepts I want to point out are going to be the division of Korea and the division of Germany. The division of Korea, we'll talk about the Korean conflict. Understand that this idea of dividing things and keeping the communist versus the non-communist separate is going to be a very attractive idea. This is going to be something that the U.S. is going to keep trying to do. And really, this ought to be flipped the other way. You see here that the division of Germany comes first. Now, initially, Germany was divided into four because the idea was we've got to keep an eye out. We don't know which Nazis are still around, and we don't want them to gain power again. Think Redeemer Democrats in the South, that kind of thing, right? So it's kind of a reconstruction plan for Germany. However, then you have the Cold War happening, and you have this tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that kind of skews this kind of reconstruction of Germany, if you will. And so you have them, what starts off as a group of four, kind of as a temporary measure for the reconstruction of Germany, then becomes a divided Germany. A West Germany that's democratic and East Germany that is not, with a line in between. You have Berlin, which is, again, divided between East Berlin and West Berlin. Eventually, it has a wall around West Berlin to kind of keep that area under control. But it's seen as a way for the communist and democratic forces to kind of basically stay in their corners, not like each other, not cooperate with each other, kind of stop each other and hold each other back without actually having a confrontation. So it's basically like giving somebody the evil eye from across the room. You know that if you say anything, if you do anything, there's going to be a fight. But if you just each stay in your own corner, then maybe you'll actually be able to get through the day, right? And so that's the whole idea about this division, and it works in Germany. Of course, Germany has has proximity to the Soviet Union, and so we certainly wouldn't want atomic bombs going off. So there's kind of a reasoning behind why the division of Germany works so well. We'll see also that we'll do the same thing in Korea. So this idea of the division of Korea is tied to containment. We're going to contain communism. Communism is going to happen in North Korea with the aid primarily of the communist Chinese. And of course, remember our bad relationship with China. Because we had backed the nationalist Chinese and all that kind of stuff. And so you're gonna have that. And so Truman is basically going to back off of really having a full-scale invasion. We're going to take over North Korea. He's just basically, okay, fine. If they want to be communist, if we want the Kim family to be dictators, they just have to do it in their neck of the woods. So you have this division between North Korea that is allowed to be communist and South Korea that is allowed to be capitalistic and democratic, or sort of democratic. Now, that's not a neat process by any stretch of the imagination. But you definitely have these two different regions. One's being influenced by the U.S. and by Japan, because remember, the U.S. has a presence in Japan at this point, and then North Korea by China. And then you can see here on this map the demilitarized zone. That's an area where there's not supposed to be any kind of military action or anything like that. So when North Korea does some crazy stuff now, they kind of, that's what they're playing with, is that demilitarized zone. And so the division of Korea is a way for us to kind of get out of Korea without continuing to engage in that conflict. And so it's very kind of interesting that happens. And again, this is tied specifically to the end of World War II, as opposed to being something that happens organically. Now, when we look at Vietnam, you'll see that Vietnam has a slightly different process. Vietnam is going to happen much later in this Cold War period, and that kind of thing. So these are just some terms I wanted to be sure that you knew. I'm going to stop it here, and then I'll pick up the next lectures beginning with kind of the Cold War and some other things. But I wanted to be sure you knew these terms as we get ready to talk about it. And so you can kind of consider this as the